firewall, PubSub, other programs, audio and video. So that is from our side. So may I now pass the word to Otto and Jan.
Yeah, hello.
Thank you, Otto. Thank you, Laura. Otto, can I give you the word?
Yes, hello. I want to welcome all of you. My name is Otto Lasky. I'm a consultant, a coach, and I am the author of the Constructive Developmental Framework, or CDF, on which this book is based. It has been a great pleasure to write this book with Jan, who I have worked with since 2009, so almost a decade. We will introduce you into what is, in my view, the first book that on teams that includes findings, empirical findings about adult development, the journey we all make as adults, which dramatically changes our emotions and our way to look at the world. So please, Jan, continue.
Thank you, Otto. I'm Jan. Welcome, everybody. I'm helping companies to cope better with complexity, and I'm assisting them in building collaborative intelligence by helping them to align their evolving business models, their organizational structure, and their human capital practices. The book which we have written is based on quite a number of case studies. And in fact, the book invites you to join a story of a management team, a story of a management team who starts to work with the developmental insights Otto was referring to. And to immediately invite you into the stories, I will start with sharing two of them. The first one is a story of a continuous improvement team. That team has recently joined the path of self-organization, and this was created due to a real business need. The real business need was that they thought they need to make the transition from a product-oriented company to a more client-centric company. And they defined for themselves three ambition levels in getting themselves organized differently. The first ambition level was the level of controlled and steered self-organization. The second one was entering a situation of coached self-organization, while a third ambition level was about trying to find a way to continuously improve the self-organizing capacity of the team. Here we see the team in the second phase, the phase where Julie, the left lady in the white dress, was asked to prepare a proposal for a new dashboard. And what happens in teams is always that there is a meeting of different developmental levels. And when you start looking at Julie as the team member who has a lower level of development, she was tasked to make a proposal, and after having done that proposal, she was very open to receive comments from all the team members. And what happened was that they started to to merge all the perspectives that were on the table, the perspective of role design, the perspective of the dashboard, the perspective of Julie's development. And so what is typically for an upwardly divided team is that different perspectives are put together and transcended in a whole. And that people agree not only on doing certain things, but they keep these agreements. This is not the case in a downwardly divided team. in a downwardly divided team, less developed people succeed in pulling the more developed people down. This is also a real team, a logistic team, busy in reviewing the logistic process. And Bart, which is on the left, made a proposal which met some resistance of other team members. And what happened was that, well, all the team members tried to convince Bart of a different perspective, but they did not succeed. Usually in downwardly divided teams, objectives are narrowed, people do not meet the agreements, milestones are not met, and so on. The notion of downwardly divided team dynamics and upwardly divided team dynamics is one of the central notions in our book. The context in which our book was created is a context of Industry 4.0. And you can consider that context, you can consider a lot of companies as the houses on the island of the fish. They consider the environment they work in as relatively stable. But what happens in Industry 4.0 is that change pushes the organization. And if you look at almost all the management literature at this moment, one key message pops up, namely that companies need to be responsive. It was one of the basic messages in the World Economic Forum in last January and February. Responsive means you need to work in a networked way, and there are a number of characteristics in that domain. Namely, there are a number of shifts. Industry 4.0 rewrites the future of work, and there are 5 mind shifts in the transformation of organization that one can observe. And the first one is an evolution in focus from profit to purpose. The second one is that hierarchies are replaced by networks. A third one, this is a bit too fast. A third one, that there is an evolution from controlling to empowering, and then from planning to experimentation, and from, let's say, a closeness to transparency on information. Those 5 trends or evolutions determine quite heavily how people work together. And the common ground in these 5 trends is that people need to think differently, and the work shifts from a focus on competencies to a higher importance of the cognitive and the social emotional dimension in work. Work gets redefined through all those technological developments, and people are asked to think more for themselves. Tasks are not standardized anymore, or not in the same way as before, and the decision space of people is increasing. The essence of those developments is that the experience of complexity increases, and at the same time the ability to cope with that complexity decreases. And it is in the space of the tension between the two that our book, Strengthening Self-Management and Collaborative Intelligence, is situated. One of the main points that we're making in our book is that the quality of dialogue becomes extremely important. The quality of dialogue will determine the kind of collaborative intelligence that will develop in teams. And that quality of dialogue is influenced by the developmental stage people are into. And Otto, perhaps you can take it from here.
Yes,
Otto?
we can say, we can look at lifespan development in terms of what is called stages. And that means that people over their lifetime acquire different ways of seeing themselves, of looking at the world, which of course is connected. And so following one of the authors, we speak of stages, and we distinguish between an instrumental stage. By the way, Jan, we do have a slide for that. Could we see that?
Well, we need to follow a bit the presentation. And perhaps, well, the essence of the stages is that how we interpret the world shifts.
Yes.
And how we interpret the world determines how we enter in the dialogue. Basically, if one looks at why organizations do not learn, there are always two things which emerge. And the two things have to do with the difference between information, and here on the screen you are seeing a number of spots. But if you look closely and you start to interpret, you can see a dog in that picture. A dog looking for something in the grass. Now, what happens through development is that the way we interpret is determined by a number of thinking structures. We can consider those thinking structures as fishing nets. I don't know who amongst you is familiar with the fishing domain, but fishermen choose their nets according to the kind of fish they want to fish. And it's the same with how we think. We are not aware that we use a number of nets in approaching and making sense and meaning of the things that we are confronted with in our organizations, but also in other domains of our life. And a lot of thinkers have already spent some time asking the question, why don't organizations and teams learn? And they have identified a number of biases. For example, the bias to success, which leads to either a fear of failure or wanting to really make a difference and a success often leads to failure, which is attributed externally. It's not my mistake. A second bias, which often happens, is a bias towards action, leading to exhaustion and a lack of reflection. A third one is a bias towards fitting into. We want to be and remain member of a group, and that often leads to a failure to use one's own strengths. And a third one is a bias towards experts, leading to a kind of a dependency and an inadequate involvement of employees in companies. Now, the two on the left are related to our quality of thinking, and the two on the right are related to our maturity. What we have done in the book is highlighting from cognitive developmental research two of the hidden dimensions. And perhaps, Otto, you can take it from here.
Yes, we speak of hidden dimensions because we are not aware of them. They are hidden to us. that means we do not really have a great deal of awareness of how our way of thinking about the world conceptually is changing over our lifetime, nor do we know how we, or have a great awareness of how we internally position ourselves towards others. And that's what I began to speak about when I mentioned what I call stages, that it has been found in empirical research that people develop from what is called an instrumental worldview to an other-dependent worldview and to a self-authoring worldview, and finally to a self-aware worldview. And of course, between these, there are intermediate stages. And that is a matter of what we call social emotional, where we have to do with ego and other. And here, when you look at this slide that's coming up here, you can see, first of all, the vertical arrow. So we speak of vertical development because the term development in English is always used in a horizontal way by saying we develop this team, we develop this and that, but actually what we call development is vertical, not horizontal. And here on the left, you can see the stages briefly described. Instrumental stage where me, I am in the foreground, and other dependent stage, the next one, in which I define myself by others' expectations. And the next stage up is called self-authoring. That means I am based in my work and my thinking on an integrated value system that is uniquely my own. So I'm risking being thrown out of groups because they don't agree with my value system, and I stand up for myself. And the next higher stage we call self-aware, which presupposes all these stages. The term stage means you can't be on stage 3 if you haven't been on stage 2. And this can all be assessed empirically through semi-structured interviews. So here the pictures we show, you can see that by Amy, the singer, whose song I think is called Will You Still Love Me When I'm, I don't know, when I'm old or so forth. That's a very superficial illustration of the other dependent stage, because she's assuming that, or she's actually defining herself by others' expectations, by others helping her, and so forth. If you go to the right of these pictures, you see, or I just saw, Nelson Mandela. Can we have Nelson Mandela? We all know of him that he has developed to a very high development stage in which he was able to endure terrible hardships and also lead his country into freedom. That is a good symbol for the self-aware stage. I'm lacking a picture for the self-authoring. Jan, can you point me to that?
Yes, the whole slide is there, Otto.
Oh, I don't know why I'm not seeing it. But anyway, we have a slide here for a self-authoring person. And Jan, could you say something about the person you were referring to in that image?
Well, yes, let me take a small recap in the sense that the essence from the hidden dimensions is that there are two types of thinking structures, two types of development that play a role in how we interpret things and how we enter in the dialogue. And the first one has to do with the tension between the ego and the other. This is what we call the social emotional maturity dimension. And the second dimension has to do with the thinking, the fluidity and the quality of thinking, which develops over the lifespan. Those two dimensions and the interplay of those two dimensions determine whether or not teams will have a downwardly or an upwardly divided focus. And with a downwardly divided focus, we mean that people which are in a developmental stage less developed will pull the higher developed people kind of in a sinking boat, while in an upward dynamic, the less developed people will be pulled upwards, and so the team will be able to come to excellent performance. Otto has already explained the differences in social emotional or in maturity level, and basically what we have here on the picture are hypotheses of 4 people in different developmental stages. We all know the left person, who at least gives the impression of acting in a very egocentric way, while at the right you have Nelson Mandela, who is very much self-aware, and Elon Musk, who has featured an article on the art of thinking for yourself, or thinking principles for yourself, is an example of someone in the self-authoring phase. Now, what is essential is that there are transitions amongst those phases, which you can see happening in teams. There is a transition between me and the other, from instrumental to other dependency. There is a difference, a development from a focus on us to the focus versus them. So these are specific tensions which people learn to cope with in the transition of one phase to another, and that play a role in how a team operates. For example, an instrumental team will be a team that will build its identity through reacting versus other teams. Now, this is the first dimension on which people evolve during their lifetime. The second dimension has to do with the thinking. And in order to illustrate this, we can ask the question, how can we start thinking about learning to consume less? Well, learning to consume less, you can approach that issue from a very logical, analytical point of view by trying to, well, differentiate different sub-dimensions in that issue. For example, the dimension on how does marketing play a role, and how sensitive are we to marketing, or what's the influence of social media, or how can we, what's the impact of the absence of cash on consuming more when you are somewhere in a shop. And all those things can be approached in a logical, analytical way, which is a reductive thinking way. And the approach that is most used is an approach based on data. Gathering data, and based on those data we will choose our actions. A second way of starting to think about how to consume less is a more systemic way, which focuses the attention on patterns in consumer behavior, on paradigms, on the relationships between systems, and so on. The third way has to do with differences and tensions between different systems, and how to transcend those tensions, and wondering how things have come into being and how they will evolve further, and what opportunities go hand in hand with the tensions. So what Otto and I tried to do was going a bit deeper in that transformational thinking, because it's in that transformational thinking that the importance of thinking structures pop up. And we make a distinction between 4 broad categories of thinking structures. And I can illustrate that by the question, well, if you look at the 2 people on the right, they have an appointment in a restaurant and the appointment doesn't show up. What will happen? What will happen is that they will start to consult their mobile phone, see if there are any missed calls, see if there are text messages. And what they are doing is that they put into presence the absence of the person who isn't showing up. The same thing happens in companies. You can, if you handle an issue, train your mind to think about what you are not thinking about yet. For example, the context, which we visualize by that fish. At the surface level, the houses are a very stable environment. But if you take a broader picture approach and you include more context, you will start to think differently. I have an experience with a customer contact center team who, in their transition towards self-management, started to self-evaluate their phone calls. And they used a questionnaire to do that. Now, they found the questionnaire developed by a previous manager, which wasn't there anymore, not fit for the purpose anymore, and they were able to gather best practice information from almost the best contact centers in Europe. And based on all those informations, they built themselves a new questionnaire. Now, what happened a few months afterwards is that they found out that the Net Promoter Score, which is the degree of proactiveness by which clients advise to work with their supplier, that went down, and they didn't understand that until I helped them to think about the essential contextual elements that were of importance. And one of those contextual elements, following a digitalization process which made possible to transfer 40% of their activity in the digital environment, the consequence of that was that they were confronted with more complex questions, more complex client questions. And then I asked, well, in what way is that context taken into account in developing your questionnaire? And they answered, gosh, not. They didn't do that. They build upon best practices provided by others and complied to that best practice, which is a sign of social emotional maturity level, trying to trying to develop something that seems to meet the expectations of others. You can, if you think at thinking structures, make a distinction between 4 types of thinking structures, symbolized by the 4 photographies here, or pictures. The second class of thinking structures has to do with how do you think about emergence? How do we interpret emergence from the past, but also in the present and in the future, which is process thinking. You can think about the relationships and have we taken into account all meaningful relationships, or you can think in terms of earthquakes, disequilibrium, things that can destabilize, and think through the potential in that destabilization, and how you will be able to coordinate the realization of that potential. These are the thought forms, categories. The quality of the dialogue, which we are talking about, is in fact a quality of dialogue related to how do we succeed in reflecting about or reflecting on our thinking, which we call level job 2 task, versus the job 1. So we make a distinction in our book between the jobs to be done, job 1, which is often client and expertise driven and determines current revenue streams in a company, and job 2. Job 2 has to do with developing oneself in collaboration with others through the quality of dialogue. The job 2 is what we define as capability driven and future practice driven. But I see that we have received a number of questions, Otto. Which one of the questions would you like to discuss now?
Yeah, thank you, Jan. So yeah, there are some some questions here and some comments, and I want to pick out a question asked by Gert-Jan de Groot, and there are comments by Nick Shannon, and all of them have to do with the interplay and the relationship of what we call social, emotional, and cognitive in teamwork. And so let me clarify that, as Jan has spoken about, the social emotional is a dimension, a hidden dimension that you can get hold of only by empirical assessment. And the same is true for the cognitive dimension. And the important thing here is that the relationship between these two dimensions are still unexplored, because people usually lump them together. And if you lump these two dimensions together, you cannot ask about questions. You cannot ask questions about their relationship. But here, going back to job 1 and 2, the notion here comes from Keegan and has to do with the fact that the work people do and their own developmental agenda are closely linked, so that you can no longer separate them, if you ever could. I mean, in human resources, people try to separate job 1 from job 2, and they didn't really succeed very well. So if we speak of organizations today that take into account job 2, that would mean that they have to pay attention to how work is assigned, especially in under distributed leadership conditions. Wherever in the workplace my own development overrides in importance the work I do, I cannot be effective. So essentially what we show in the book is how that happens, and what are the consequences and how to avoid it. We actually speak of building enabling environments around this issue of how can we structure work in such a way that people do not feel that their job too, their own development, their own respect for themselves, their own capacity, questions about that are not overwhelming the work they're supposed to do. So Gert-Jan says rightfully here, what happens, or he asks.
If I can add to this,
yeah?
In fact, we make a distinction between different dialogue spaces, and that's perhaps one of the answers we give to how cognitive development starts to influence different team dynamics.
Yes.
And in order to describe that, we have made a distinction between 3 different, in fact 4 different we spaces, which we call dialogue spaces. And the first one we discuss in our book is the example of the continuous improvement V-space. It's a V-space where people use models and use frameworks, often predefined. As you see in the picture, the model lies on the table and the team members have a lot of difficulties making the difference between the model and the reality. They consider the model as being the reality, but of course that's not the case. And in such teams, you can benefit a lot from thinking experiments, which is visualized by the left under picture. The dynamic in such teams is a dynamic between instrumentally developed people and other dependent people. Instrumental people wanting to push their agenda, and other dependent people looking for anchors to hang on, for expertise. We talk about downwardly developed teams. If the instrumental people succeed in in overwhelming a bit the other dependent ones, in convincing them to agree. But what happens in those teams are two very fundamental dynamics. And the first one is the right-wrong discussion, which you have, and which is very difficult and time-consuming to get out. And the second discussion that is typical for that kind of team is the simplification discussion. Can we make it more simple? You can only break through that downwardly oriented dynamic by starting to invest in system thinking, and you see here the two symbols in context thinking and in process thinking. The other dependent people want to follow the best practice, but the instrumental people want to follow their own agenda, and that's the essence of that conflict. The second type of team and dialogue space is the end-to-end value team stream space. These are the teams gathered or populated by people from different units, different departments in organizations, and they want to create clarity in the operational flows. And if you imagine that each of those team members has already a trajectory of investing in continuous improvement and right-wrong in their own department, you can visualize how difficult it is to get aligned and to support one direction. What happens in those teams is a tension between the other dependent team members who comply to their own insights and frameworks, consider it being an ICT framework or a logistics framework or a sales framework or a HR framework, and the self-authoring people who have already discovered that there are limits on all those frameworks and started to build their own ideas. But the downwardly divided end-to-end or value stream dialogue is one of us versus them, the HR versus ICT, or the financial department versus another department. And you can only get out of such team dynamics through very specific thought experiments, what we label as introduce cognitive diversity. And in our book, we give plenty of examples of how you can introduce cognitive diversity. One of the ways, for example, is rethinking the feedback mechanisms through which people can discover that their view on reality is a fragmented view. But in the end-to-end value stream space, you will benefit a lot by introducing the relational thinking or thought structures and systems thinking. The next we space or dialogue space is in the rethinking business models. And as you see on the left, the team members are very much aware that they miss pieces in the puzzle that they need to integrate. Often this space is populated by self-authoring and self-aware people. And the basic tension between them is the me amongst them all. Of course, also in the business modeling space, you have a lot of people still in the other dependency or in the instrumental phase. And so the team dynamic becomes a bit more complex. But the more lower developed people or people in a lower developmental stage, the higher the probability that the dialogue will be downwardly oriented. You can only break through that through, again, introducing cognitive diversity in a specific way and starting to work on the social emotional maturity domain. So I see Gert-Jan de Groot asking a question, so you define these V spaces by the combination of different social emotional levels and their conflicts? Yes, but also by the fluidity of thinking which is present in those groups.
Jan, I would like to address questions about V spaces.
Yes, okay, but we do not have the time because we have still 10 minutes to go.
Okay, fine, go ahead.
At this moment. So I would like to proceed, and if we have time at the end of the presentation, I would like to pick up on a number of questions, if that's okay for you.
Yeah, go ahead.
So in each of those V spaces, people need to work together. And so the question pops up, how can we get to collaborative intelligence? And during our work in facilitating organizational development and transitions in companies, especially in restructuring, we found three themes popping up again and again. And the first one is about creating trust. And if you look at trust from a developmental point of view, this is about the congruity of mutual expectations of competence. The second dimension is, or question is, how to co-mobilize, and people will only start to take common initiatives if they at least have the impression that a number of percentage of colleagues will go the same way. And so you need to start looking at developmental coherence of networks. Coordination is a third issue, which is about the presence of catalysts to create common knowledge. In our book, we make reference to a number of examples, especially in the societal domain, where you have all kinds of developmental levels and all kinds of thinking maturity, of thinking fluidity and differences where you need to cope with. So the quality of dialogue is very important, and this is both an internal and an external dialogue. The internal dialogue, and I'm looking at the slides to follow. Laura, can you help me that the slides move? Yes, thank you. The internal dialogue, and Otto, do you want to give a very brief comment on the essence of the internal dialogue?
Okay, so we are distinguishing in the book between internal and external dialogue, and there are, of course, many internal dialogues in which we speak to each other. We speak to ourselves, sorry. By internal dialogue, we mean the dialogue we have with ourselves before and as a basis of the external dialogue in which we speak to others. And of course, there are many internal dialogues. There are emotional dialogues, cognitive dialogues, spiritual dialogues, aesthetic dialogues. There are a lot of those dialogues, but here in this book we focus on the internal dialogue that is often called thinking, because we know, or we think we know, how we can help people understand their own thinking and the structure of this thinking. So when Jan pointed out the 4 classes of thought forms or thought structures, he meant to say that in the book we conceive of the internal dialogue as structured in terms of these thought structures. And these thought structures or thought forms can be precisely assessed through empirical interviews, as has been done for 20 years. And we can evaluate people's thinking at any moment in time and give feedback on that, as we can also with the social emotional dialogue. And one of the main points in the book is that we say we cannot really understand team dialogue as an external dialogue, meaning between people, if we don't look at the structure and quality of the internal dialogue in terms of thought structures. So we make a link between the quality of dialogue based on internal dialogue, based on thought structures on the one hand, and the degree of self-organization and collaborative intelligence in teams. And that is new in the team literature, because we are not ascribing to the team as such any kind of mythical quality about being collaborative or being self-organizing. We are saying these team qualities are rooted in individual developmental levels and how they come together in teams. That would be a short explanation I would want to give.
Yeah. And essentially, when we think, we need to ask ourselves the question, if we think about the subject, how is that subject part of the broader context, or how is the issue we are thinking of, how has that developed until the moment it presents itself as a problem, or we can use different ways to think about the relationships we are making, or different ways on thinking about tensions and disequilibria and transformational challenges. These are the basic points of departure to start reflecting on our thinking. And they help us to make the distinction between how we think and what reality is. Now, the external dialogue is a dialogue between, and here you see the different content issues we are using in transition processes. It's always a dialogue which is about setting priorities and ownership, about feedback processes, about how do we maintain the coherence here, and about identity and sense making.
We need that picture.
So
we need that picture that comes and goes away. Yeah, that one. Thank you.
So it's always an issue about how do we think about the relationships between, for example, role design and strategy, between meeting practices and dashboard indicators, between the governance and the purpose. So the traditional way of approaching organizational transformation is putting all those interventions in a certain sequence, but not thinking about how they co-evolve, not thinking about the essential relationships on a deeper level. What we do in the book is giving you a lot of examples of how you can start thinking about relationships, and at the same time we help you and introduce a number of new techniques, for example, to describe roles through storytelling, to a different meeting practice process, and so on. So you'll find both a number of ideas on how to think holistically about organizational development and team development, and at the same time be surprised on a number of very concrete tools that you can find. One of the concrete tools is what you see here, instead of thinking in terms of competency development, thinking in terms of where are we in our thinking in the comfort zone, where is someone in his or her stretch zone, anxiety zone, and no development zone, and how do you approach development of people in those different zones, which, for example, if you have a team in a continuous improvement process, some team members will be very comfortable, while other team members will be stretched, and others will say, well, what happens here? I'm an expert. Do I really need to be involved in this situation? So what we give is a number of tools to enable you to start facilitating the transition process in teams from a downward focus to an upward focus in team development. And then we spend a few words on the implementation steps, which we see essentially as a choreography. And by that I mean that change does not happen steps-wise, but is the result of an iterative process of viewing how team makes progress, for example, in their roles and collaboration processes, together with how they make progress in feedback, and so on. And the development in one domain determines how you develop in the other domain. It's a kind of a dance over different key dimensions which make up the success of a program. And that brings me essentially to the end of this talk. You can, of course, learn more in our book, and that book can be ordered through the site of Connect and Transform, through following that link. And I think Laura will make that link appear on the public chat. You only need to click through the link and you will be able to order the book. At the same time, I would like to invite everyone to attend the Dynamic Collaboration Masterclass, where we will go deeper into how to assess thinking structures, but always applied to the subject of how do you strengthen self-organization, how do you prevent self-organization falling back to a hierarchical modus. And the key question during the masterclass will be how can we really succeed in developing and strengthening collaborative intelligence in the different kind of we spaces that we distinguish in the book. So may I all invite you to certainly order the book, and if you have any questions, do not hesitate to share them with Otto and myself. We consider the book as a moment in our mutual learning process. It integrates a lot of practice, a lot of case studies in organizations, and a lot of research that Otto has done. I think it's a very useful integration. I'm applying it at this moment in 7 organizational development trajectories, with a lot of positive feedback of my clients. So I hope that you will be able to benefit from the same experience by exploring the book.
Thank you for attending.
We perhaps do have a few minutes for some extra questions. Or Otto, do you want to add something?
No, I just wanted to thank participants for their patience in our going through this. And as you say, they are all invited to contact us. I see here a contact request by Nick Parker. Nick, do you have a question right here? No. Okay. We are out of time.
Well, I would say we are at the end of our slot. Thank you everybody for attending this webinar. I hope each one of you found some inspiring ideas. And as I said, do not hesitate to mail your questions either to Otto or to myself. We will be very happy to respond. Thank you very much, and well, have a nice day.
Thank you, Jan.
Bye.
Thank you. And Margarita, thank you for your help.